Annabel Croft. I am thrilled that you've joined us on our Therapy Works podcast. You've just stepped off the Strictly Come Dancing competition, but you're about to go on tour and very well known as a professional tennis player and a sports presenter and a mother of three. And I feel like I've got to know you over these 12 weeks of watching you on Strictly, having kind of known of you before, but I feel like you've shown us so much more of yourself than I've known. And that's been a really warming, engaging experience. And the first question I always ask anyone who comes on the podcast, what is a challenge that you are facing or have faced?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's lovely to chat to you today. What is the challenge? I guess I'm in new territory. I had no concept of grief whatsoever before this happened to our family. And, you
Do you want to say what happened?
Basically, on January the 31st last year, my husband went for a kind of a routine, what I thought was just a checkup. And we went to the appointment together, and he was told that he basically didn't have very long to live. So you can imagine, straight out of the bat, going to this hospital and going to see a consultant. And I have visions of being in the car park before we went in, and my husband saying to me, I'm a bit worried about this meeting. And me saying, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. Of course, lots of people go for consultations and they'll probably find a little blip, and you might have to have a small operation to have something removed or whatever, but I'm sure it'd be absolutely fine. And then to find that in that meeting, literally the words that came out of the surgeon's mouth were, I'm afraid your life expectancy is not very good. And
Whoa.
I just literally was floored. From my whole world went into a spin from that moment.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to start crying already. I can't believe it.
Oh.
But
it's taken you back there, hasn't it? It's almost exactly a year ago, and it's thrown you back in time of the devastation of the sort of innocence in the car park. And then that sentence, you don't have very long to live.
I just remember looking at him, and the world was spinning, and he was so brave. He just took it on the chin. And I said to the consultant, I can't believe those words have just come out of your mouth. And he just said, well, some of us draw the short straw, and today it was me, and I'm afraid I've had to deliver this bad news to you. And then
he went on.
Yeah, it was horrendous. It was as bad as it could possibly be. It was like the worst day of my life.
But also the way
it's still the worst day of my life. Sorry, I didn't think I was going to get this upset so quickly, but I think back to so many parts of that day, and trying to make some sense of this horrendous news, and just looking at Mel and thinking, wow, I should be supporting you, and he was supporting me because I was in such a state. But he died about 3.5 months later, and it was so fast, and I'm still trying to come to terms with it. We're still a bit traumatized by it, and we're still in shock. But when you asked me that first question, what's the challenge? I guess every day is just to try to make sense of it and move forward positively, but it's quite hard.
But also in some ways, trying to make sense of it, there's no sense to be made of the man who you met when you were 21, who was perfectly healthy in your mind 1 minute before, and then told incredibly brutally, it seems to me. I mean, the way you're told the news has a big impact, like it was bad luck on him having to deliver the news. It's like, excuse me, it was you receiving it he should have been thinking about.
It was very cold, and brutal is the only way to describe it. And the most extraordinary thing was that, Mel said, he started listing off what was going to happen to Mel, and he said, have you got your papers in order? You might not have that long. And he said, I might have to do an operation to give you a stoma bag. Then we might or might not reverse it, but then you'll go into chemotherapy very quickly, but really the life expectancy is not very good. And so I was trying to absorb all of this information, but I remember Mel saying to him, well, if I'm going to have an operation, what do you think I should be eating before the operation? What kind of food should I be eating? And this gentleman said, I'm afraid I know nothing about nutrition. It's not my department, but if I was you, I'd have some chocolate if I was you. If you fancy some chocolate, have some. And
so dismissive.
It was quite dismissive. And when I look back on it and the knowledge that I now have with the cancer specialist that we then worked with, she said, anybody who tells anybody with cancer to have sugar, it's malpractice, because anyone who knows anything about cancer, and she studies it every day and she looks at the cells every day. And if you put glucose in the body, the cells divide and spread, and you are spreading the cancer. And, even she says it's extraordinary when people are having chemotherapy that they offer cake and biscuits and tea in the room where you're waiting to have that treatment. And that is her field. And so it's something out there that held on to, because I think, well, gosh, I just want to tell everybody that if they're suffering from cancer or they know someone who has cancer, just really stay away from as much sugar or carbohydrate or glucose as possible, because you're literally spreading it in your body.
Sugar grows cancer. I feel different pulls to go down. One is that sense of Mel was supporting you and you felt that you should be supporting him, but also the trauma of the whole family, that it's all of you that are so devastated. And I don't know what's the thing that's sitting with you that distresses you the most when you kind of look back at that day.
There's so many things, because like you said, I've known him since I was 21. I've never known a life without
your whole
him.
Adult life. Yeah.
And he was unbelievably supportive of me and my whole career. He was the best husband I could have had. And we were incredibly happy. And we didn't want for much. We just used to walk every day or run every day, sit on the park benches and just look at the wildlife. And we always said to each other, we don't need much more than this. I'm just really happy. So I didn't see it coming.
We really loved each other. It was just a fit that he supported and believed and loved you, and vice versa.
Yeah, he told me every night when we went to bed, I'm going to miss you all night. Can't wait to see you in the morning.
Oh my goodness.
We always talked about where we were going to live in the future, the retirement. I couldn't wait till neither of us were working so that we could actually enjoy just downtime, because life's been pretty hectic and fast. And so it feels like it's been cut short. And I felt like he's been denied another 30 years, maybe, together. Sorry, I don't know if everybody sobs their way through your podcast, but I hope I'm not going to sob all the way through it. I don't know. I presume they bring a box of tissues with them, but
they do. They do it. People do. I
mean, that is okay. I'm not the only one.
You're by no means the only one, and I really appreciate your emotional honesty. And I feel like in some ways Strictly really helped you, but it also put it to one side. And so I guess part of the task for you is grief. One of the definitions of grief is being robbed. And not only have you been robbed of Mal in your daily life and him saying I love you every night and supporting you, but the future that you had every right to expect and hope for, growing old together, seeing your grandchildren, seeing your children grow and develop. And that's a huge loss, isn't it? It's so impossible to get your head around of the future.
It is, because he was such a big character. I mean, he was a big man anyway. He was 6'4.5", so he had a presence every time he came into a room. And he was growing more handsome as he got older. I always said that.
He was very handsome, I must say.
Yeah, he was really handsome, but he had a terrific sense of humour, and he disarmed people the minute he walked into a room or whoever he met. And he appealed to every person in any walk of life or whatever they did. He would chat to everybody. He'd make them laugh. He'd bring them down to ground level immediately and just make people see the funny side in life. He didn't take it too seriously, and he made me laugh every day. And I miss his humour terribly. But I just never, ever thought these things happened to you. And I'm sure everybody says that.
Yeah.
But I really didn't. And every morning I made a cup of tea for us. And we used to chat every morning in bed with a cup of tea. And I make my tea still. But obviously I look to my right and he's not there. And every night I go to bed and he's not there. And it's just a bit weird.
Yeah. That presence of absence is so daunting, isn't it? It's so, like, from 21, it's like everything you've known about how to live, how to wake up, have your day and go to sleep, like he top and tailed.
Yeah.
And in between
we just had a really
made you laugh.
Good routine. Yeah, we had a very compatible relationship and we grew together. When I met Mel, he was a sailor and a yachtsman, and so we'd had a very similar sort of lifestyle in that he was like sailing all around the world, very sporty, and I was doing my tennis all around the world. And, he traveled a lot, and we just had a similar outlook on life. And, he didn't own a pair of normal shoes. And so, he didn't earn very much money when I met him. He was just working on boats. And I feel like everything we achieved together, we grew together and we built everything together. And then we obviously had a family together and we had lots to look forward to together. So I don't want to sound all doom and gloom. I feel like I need to get a violin out at the moment, but
it's true, though.
It's the shock of, and I now realise that lots of people go through it, and I had no concept of it. But I guess we're all, whoever goes through it, you learn the hard way, don't you? And you can't quite believe that somebody who was a living, breathing, talking, thinking, humorous person in your life, it feels like they just evaporated in front of you. And I keep saying in my head, where did you go? What happened to you? The brain has clearly stopped working because you're no longer alive. And I saw him take his last breath. But where did he go? It's hard to get your head around it.
And do you have a kind of belief system of where he is? I mean, he's clearly in your heart, that he's part of you, and your love for him is so present. But do you have a spiritual belief or a wondering?
Just a wondering, really. I'm sort of open-minded about all of that. He never really believed anything afterwards. He always used to say, I think once you've gone, that's it. But I'm just not sure. I don't know. My grandmother was very into spiritualist churches and going to try and seek her husband, when he died. And she used to say you should get messages from people. Yeah, she used to look into all of that stuff. And I don't really know what to believe. I've met people in my life who've proved to me that energy exists and that there's ways of harnessing energy and proving that they can harness energy from a room. And that particular person sort of did used to speak to spirits and things, and I was a bit scared of all of that stuff. But it's not to say I don't think any of it does exist, or I don't really know.
You're open.
It's comforting. Like. Yeah, I'm sort of open to it, but I don't know. I don't really know what to think at the moment. I feel like we're still all a little bit traumatized by everything. I speak to my children. My son came back to live with me, and we obviously chat a lot, and every day we just say to each other, where on earth did he go? He used to sit in the same seat in our kitchen when we'd all have supper together, or he'd make breakfast, and we all have our specific where we sit in the kitchen. And we keep saying, well, he normally sits there. It's just hard to believe that he's no longer there. So we're just sort of muddling through. And as you said, Strictly was a wonderful distraction for me, and it was something so positive and wonderful to be all day dancing and using your body and being around lots of people who are very positive. So I feel like the whole experience was amazing. And, I'm hoping that the tour will be very distracting and wonderful as well. But it's putting, as you say, to one side, a grief that comes in big waves. And sometimes it comes and you just don't know when it's coming. And it just comes in a great, enormous wave. And then you just sob and you get it out of your system and then you feel better. But I don't know how long it goes on for. I presume for the rest of my life. I don't know.
I mean, I think the intensity changes. And as you've been aware, I guess the amount of waves that hit you changes, the intensity. It can be just as intense now, but then sometimes you have a wave that's smaller, and that does change over time. And the purpose of it is updating your database. That question you've asked, like, where is he when you expect to see him in the chair, is the pivotal psychological question, isn't it? Because the task for all of you and your 3 children is facing the reality of letting yourself know in a way that you finally believe, which you have not got to, that he isn't physically present.
Yeah.
And that is the task of mourning, which is really painful. But also what helps you is what Strictly enabled you is the love and connection to others. It felt to me like Johannes was, I think you actually said it was sent to you in some way, because he's so funny, which is Mel, but also full of love, and the movement and the kind of creativity together held you in a way, it felt to me.
Oh, there's no question about it. I felt like Johannes was like an angel that was sent because he's dealt with a lot of grief in his life as well.
Yes, he
So,
understood.
yeah, he understood and he did tell me that. And he's an amazing ball of light. When he walks into a room, he brings this absolutely amazing energy into a room. He has the most wonderful physical presence and very thoughtful, very in tune with everything, and just an amazing artist to work with. The whole experience was incredibly uplifting and fun. And as you say, his laughter just filled the room. And he reminded me so many times of me just being hysterical with Mel. And I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to laugh like that again. But Johannes proved that laughter can still be part of my life. And also, I know that Mel, he would be almost having a sense of humor about what's happened. I know that he would have found fun in some of this darkness and made us laugh. And we've often, as a family, kind of talked about that. You know, we
And
haven't
he
picked up his
loved
ashes
he
yet,
loved
actually.
Johannes. Oh, haven't you?
He did absolutely love Johannes when he used to watch him on the television and called us all to the screen to watch him dancing, and used to sometimes have tears running down his face because he was very in touch with his emotions himself. And so for me to be paired with him, it was kind of bittersweet because it was reminding me of the times that Mel was watching him on the screen in our house, but then also how wonderful that I got to meet this amazing man and dance with him, but then heartbreaking that they never met each other. So that was quite hard for me, thinking, gosh, they would have got on so well, they would have made each other roar with laughter. You know, it's still painful, that, because I really feel like they should have met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Um,
bittersweet. So it's almost like you can conjure Mel and imagine what he could say, but it's extremely painful that he didn't get to meet him, and
yeah,
it
it really
feels
is.
cruel in some ways.
It does feel cruel because I think that's the hardest thing to deal with, death within the family, and particularly if it's your husband or whatever, but or anyone, I suppose, who's really close to you. It's coming to terms with the fact that they're never coming back. Because part of you keeps thinking, oh, but at some point I'll speak to them. And of course, I'm looking ahead at life and I'm 57 and I'm thinking, gosh, now for the rest of my life, I won't ever be speaking to him again. And that's just such a weird thing to try to get your head around. It's like, how weird. I've spoken to him every day for 36 years and I've never really been a long period of time without speaking to him. And now I'm thinking, gosh, I've got to go the rest of my life and I won't experience, I can remember the humour, but I won't be experiencing it again. And I've just got to hang on to all the positive parts. I mean, lots of people have come forward and said to me, you have to remember and have the memories there of the happy times and the love. And of course, you try to do that, but there's an awful lot of stuff caught in the middle of the ending, which is just so depressing and gloomy, and traumatizing is the only way to describe it. So I'm trying to replace some of the trauma and the hospital part of it and the last few moments and stuff that went on at the hospital, and then try to replace it with some of the happier stuff.
Yeah, I can really get that, in that really holding both the memories and the love and the kind of gratitude for being loved and seen and known, and loving him in the way that you did and building what you built. But also the loss is equal to the love, right? So the future without that is incredibly daunting. And it does sound like the trauma isn't naturally adaptive, so grief is naturally adaptive. And I'm quite curious, and this may make me sound like the consultant that spoke to you, that the trauma that you're talking about of his dying in the hospital, it would probably give you flashes that would interfere with your capacity to grieve adaptively. And yet, interestingly, dance is a very good treatment for trauma. So the connection of your mind and body, it sends neurotransmitters around your system that is naturally regulating and helps with trauma. Yoga, dance, and EMDR are the three best treatments for trauma.
Wow.
So it feels like there is still trauma there, because I can see it as you were speaking, and yet maybe dancing was also helpful.
Well, I definitely think the dancing was helpful because I could just feel a bit freer. And there were times when I was getting grief out, but then I could just refocus, and I felt like I was just getting more and more free as I went on through the 12 weeks that we danced together. But
You did open,
I
I could see
definitely
that.
think, Yeah, it definitely felt like that. It felt like there'd been some shifting and, yeah, just something positive out of all of this darkness. But I think we are a little bit traumatized by the hospital and how everything ended. And this particular woman, I don't know what her title was, I don't know her name, but she was the one who, when we went into hospital, delivered terrible news. Because when we were going to hospital that day, and he went off in an ambulance, and you look back at that whole last day, I thought he was going into hospital to get help and some treatment, and I was quite relieved because it was getting quite bad at home, and I just didn't think I could cope much more. And I thought, oh, thank goodness he's going in to get treatment and help, and he'll be coming home later, or
So you
maybe
had no
tomorrow, or whatever.
idea, not a clue.
No, because I didn't realise that he was actually dying of sepsis, even though his body was riddled with cancer. He had a perforation in his colon, and the poison was killing him. And
Oh
he
gosh,
couldn't really walk anymore, and his whole body was grinding to a halt. And he was
so
struggling to
painful,
breathe, and it was just awful to witness. And we
terrible.
were a bit naive, watching it, because we didn't realise until he actually said to me, Annabelle, I need assistance. I can't really breathe. And we got the ambulance there, and he went into hospital, and we just were so relieved that he was going to get help, and thinking that he was coming home. We didn't think that was his last day. Anyway, this dreadful woman, who I can only describe as a psychopath, came to deliver the news with almost glee, and all of us could sense it. And even our wonderful Isabella, who was his cancer specialist, she was there and witnessed it as well. And this woman came to say, basically, he's got an 80% chance of not surviving any particular operation that we might do. And she was the person to deliver the news between the surgeons and the family. She was called a surgeon's something or other, and she delivered. And then I said to her, please, can you keep your voice down? I don't want him to hear what you're saying, because he was lying there, and she was saying, no, he has to hear this information. He's going to die, and he's got cancer all over his body. And she had this tone of voice that was very authoritative, but it was almost like, I don't care what you think about whether he hears this or not. He's the patient, and he needs to hear this information. And I thought, I didn't want him to hear that information because it was brutal. And then she came back for a bit more, and she said, oh, and by the way, if he has a heart attack, we're not reviving him, okay? And he had, having been drifting in and out of consciousness, perked up and said, I don't like the sound of a DNR, which I was surprised he even knew what that term was. And I said to her, please, I don't want him to hear. I don't like the sound of that. That sounds awful. And again, she just said, listen to me. He's got cancer all over his body. If he has a heart attack, we're not reviving him. And I think that's the bit that I'm most traumatized by, is that in his last day of life, he was hearing this woman almost gleeful and telling him he was going to die. And I can only describe her manner and attitude as somebody who was getting enjoyment from what she said, because I can't imagine how you could possibly deliver that news the way that she did and feel good about yourself. But we all witnessed it, and I'm not imagining it.
No,
And then I've had thousands of people write to me after I spoke about it in an article, which actually a donation was made to the cancer charity. And thousands of people were coming forward saying that they had had similar experiences, which is quite shocking. But I think that's what gives us the most trauma as a family, is that that was how he heard that information. And I just don't think that was right. And I don't know why that woman is in the care sector when you can be that uncaring and unkind to somebody when they're dying.
yeah. I kind of feel the shock in my body. And I'm wondering what's your body feeling as you remember. I mean, I can imagine that you want to kill her on the one hand. I mean, not actually, but psychologically. But what it is does the trauma feel stuck in your body as you're telling
Um,
me what's happening?
well, my body starts to shake a bit, but I've relived it so many times. And I visualize him on the bed hearing it and how he was reacting to it. And I'm just upset that he had to hear it. It's awful.
It is awful that you had to hear it.
I can't imagine how you could ever say to someone, I'm not going to revive you if you have a heart attack. Thank goodness he didn't have a heart attack, because then that would have been even more traumatizing to witness that. But
Yeah,
it's like,
I'm so sorry.
how could you enjoy saying to somebody when they're dying? Why would you say that?
It's
I'd love to ask that
incomprehensible.
lady. I
What would
would
you
love to
like to
see her.
say to her? What would you like to say to her?
I'd just like to understand why she's doing the job that she's doing, and
how she cannot think about the care of that person and have some kind of empathy for people on their deathbed. But I imagine that she's dealing with it so often, she's become desensitized to it, is the only way I can look at it, because I can't imagine how you wouldn't want to comfort somebody when you know they're dying, as she did, but why you're enjoying telling them. I just think it's slightly twisted, and
it's the pleasure part of it that makes me feel physically sick.
Well, it was the tone of her voice.
Of power. Yeah.
It felt like she was enjoying the power over what was happening, and
you're all so vulnerable.
Yeah, I suppose my trauma comes from being in that hospital room, and sometimes I lie in bed thinking about it, and I'm not sure when those memories will go away. I try to think of all the happy times, but the ending of how he was listening to that information on the bed, and he started to list lots of things for the family, which is when I suddenly realised that he knew he was going to die, where he hadn't done that before. So he was sort of thinks, some of it was quite amusing. He'd say things like, Charlie, the van wheel needs changing, because he knew it was going flat and he didn't want Charlie to drive the van with a flat wheel.
Oh, still loving you so much.
Yeah, he was. And then he was talking to all the children's partners and saying he was sorry that he couldn't be there, went to walk my two daughters down the aisle, or couldn't be there when they eventually hopefully get married one day. And he was just listing all this stuff, pensions, and it all came out in one go, which again was quite traumatizing, because it's like, gosh, I now know that you're going to die. This is the first time that I know that, and that I know that you know that.
You hadn't talked about that at all before?
No, never mentioned it. He'd been very positive, and that was upsetting to know that he suddenly knew he was going to die. And so, of course, we relived that quite a bit as well. So I don't know what other people say to you, but
I mean, it's. I think him knowing he's going to die and being able to say the things that he said to all of you feels quite important, in that he could continue to love you and parent his children, knowing that he was dying, and that in some way he probably knew before. It's likely he knew before, but it being out in the open for all of you so that you were actually talking about it might be helpful. What is unforgivable and unbearable is the manner and the brutality and the pleasure with which that he was told, or the way that it came about. I think you could have had a tender conversation, a loving conversation that actually wouldn't have traumatized all of you.
Yeah,
but it was.
I think so.
Because what he said to you feels important. And actually, I was thinking, it might be nice to write all that down, that what he'd said, and because it's part of his legacy, and that you do remember and you will remember, but having it written down might be really lovely for all of you as a family to write down what you remember him saying.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never thought about that, but maybe I'll suggest it to all of the family, because we have very clear memories of that time, obviously. So it would be quite nice to write that all down, actually, even though several months have passed now, but it's very raw in our heads.
Yeah, it's like a live video. I can see it's like you're there. And I was wondering, the other thing as a family you might do that might help with that day is write to him about what you all feel about that day. Write him a letter together that you can all contribute to, about what you feel upset about, what you want him to know, what you felt. You kind of express it, because it feels like it's got stuck in your body in some way, that you feel so protective of him and so furious that you want to be able to say something more to him.
I think, yeah, there is part of us that have discussed the fact that it was all happening so fast that we felt like we never had a chance to talk to him, because he had a chance to list all those things, and then suddenly he was drifting, and then he was gone, and we never discussed death together, and we never discussed anything. Actually, we didn't realise it was going to happen that way
so fast.
No, and it almost, I said to my son yesterday, it felt like he had a car accident or something, because he was just here and then gone, and it all happened so quickly. But it was just a horrible way to see somebody go, I think. But I'm sure everybody says that. I mean, everybody must have awful memories of every different way that somebody must go, but there's never a good way, is there?
Well, I mean, how somebody dies has a big impact on your grieving, and yours sounds very traumatic. And I think it's true that you can never be prepared for someone's death, even if you've had all the conversations and you've talked about dying. I think at some level it always feels a huge shock. It does feel intensified and made more complex by what happened with you two, and particularly by that person. It doesn't sound like either of you fully realised the implications of what you'd first been told in January.
No,
Because both
I
of you
don't
are
think.
optimistic. You went for hope, right?
Yeah, we did. We worked with this amazing scientist, Isabella, who works every day in the cancer field, and she studies it. And she has just published some papers, actually. I think she's the first scientist to do it, publishing on metabolic therapy. It's ketogenic metabolic therapy. And on the last scans on his body before he died, that day before he died, it showed that the cancer had pulled back from 97% across his whole liver. I mean, he had colon cancer, but it had spread across his liver. And she said when she first saw the scans in January, she'd never seen a patient with that much cancer. She couldn't believe that he was still alive. He had so much cancer riddled across his whole body. But he went on a very severe ketogenic diet, and she's worked with many people and had huge successes. And the cancer had pulled back to 70% across the liver. It was working, but what we couldn't anticipate was the colon had perforated, and so it was actually sepsis that got him. And we'd gone on this, what I call the fateful flight. We'd taken a flight to Portugal where he was running our tennis academy out there, and I think the flight may have perforated it. We don't know, but something happened on that flight where when he got off the flight, his feet were all blown up, and he definitely wasn't well, and the pains, which had completely disappeared, suddenly came back. But anyway, I suppose what I was trying to say was that her work was, we believe, working, and she gave him so much positivity. And so, in contrast to this dreadful woman at the hospital, Isabella had always been incredibly positive, and he always had a positive outlook on the future. He always thought he was going to beat it. And she always said, I never tell patients that there's nothing I can do or there's nothing that they can do, because, you never know the mind, you never know how somebody's going to react to anything. So you always give them hope.
Yeah.
And so I'm very grateful that she gave him hope in his last 3 months, and he was very, very hopeful and very positive. So I imagine that's why when we went to the hospital, he himself wouldn't have thought that he was going to die that day. But as I said, that woman really enjoyed telling him that he was.
I'm so sorry.
It's horrific.
It is horrific. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
And what I get from what you're saying is that the horror is still in you, and also Isabella and the hope that she gave you is still in you. And that is an incredibly important kind of guide for you, is that having hope. So having hope while he was alive, but again, having hope now, looking into your unknown future, is an incredibly important part of you. How you develop hope, how you both have a plan for it, a plan B, and the belief that you can make things happen. And I saw that in your process during Strictly, is that you have a lot of fear, it seemed to me, but you have a lot of courage to withstand the fear. So you had this capacity to endure great difficulty and overcome it.
Yeah, that's a really good, very good way of assessing it, actually, because I was quite terrified doing the dancing, because it's quite terrifying doing something that's out of your comfort zone and putting yourself in a position where you can make a fool of yourself, or you might get it wrong, and you're in front of about 9 million people live on a Saturday night. But I suppose after what we've been through, I just sort of thought, well, what could be worse than what we've been through? So nothing really will live up to that. So actually put aside your ego and just have a go and just go for it, even though my heart was racing and it was absolutely pounding. But, I kind of enjoyed the challenge, and there was hope in it. And I thought, actually, there's joy, and it just can prove that you can get out of bed and go and find fun in life again and be around people and live, not just sort of completely sink into hopelessness. And I think that's what life has got to be about now, is just to find a way to enjoy and make the most of the time that we all have here on the planet, and the friends that I've got in my life who've been so incredible. But I just need to find a way to just occupy myself and get to the end, is how I say it. Get to the end and enjoy it positively as much as I can. And I think with Isabella's work, I feel like she's doing such amazing work that maybe I can help her in some way to get her work recognised even more, or more people to see the papers that she's going to be. Well, she's published some already, which is the first of its kind. And I think
maybe there's put the link on the show notes to her papers.
Oh, I will.
Send it to me.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I feel like she's an amazing scientist. She's an incredible woman, and she's a really special human being in terms of her own empathy and thoughtfulness and kindness. She's the opposite, but she's a very special person. And, I think the work that she's doing is pioneering, and it could change the way that cancer is treated and the way that it goes forward. And I feel like maybe this in Mel's legacy is what might happen, is that we can work with her and help her get her work recognised even more, is how I feel. So I feel like I will throw myself at that as well.
It's so interesting how you naturally, instinctively are finding the ways of being that are naturally supportive, in that you're finding meaning from Mel's death in the ketogenic research and the metabolic research. And I've heard quite a lot about that. I listened to a Rangan Chatterjee podcast with the man who does the research too about diet, and it was very interesting, very convincing, very persuasive. But also that that even though you feel like, or you have a huge part of you has died, in that Mel has died, you're choosing life. You're choosing to have life in your life and to go for finding joy, finding glimmers, finding people, finding connection, movement in your body, dancing, which is the thing that will enable you to survive and actually live till you get to the end. And not, some people, they live, but there's no life in their life, whereas you want to live and have life in your life whilst you still grieve and miss Mel.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, when you say it like that, I suppose that's absolutely true. I feel like I've always been somebody that kind of, had a lot of energy, used to apparently exhaust all my school friends, according to my mum, because they couldn't keep up with my energy. So I have to have an outlet for that energy. But yeah, I do feel like the only way to go forward now is to get out of bed every day, make sure I, put some makeup on and try and be positive about putting clothes on, putting some makeup on, go and look how you would try to look your best for the day, and go and attack it with, well, thank you. I just feel like, I don't want to sink and just absolutely fall apart as a crushed person, even though sometimes inside I feel like that. I feel like I need to just keep going forward and making the most of what is out there. And I do have some wonderful, wonderful friends, and they have really kept me going. I don't know what I would have done without them. And obviously my children have been absolutely incredible as well. And I sometimes forget that even though I'm grieving, I need to keep reminding myself that they are too, that they've lost their dad. And, even though Mel was my partner and my life partner, he was their dad. So I have to keep reminding myself that they're also suffering as much, and we talk together as a family. But I think we're all trying to bolster each other and find lots of happy memories. We talk about lots of things. We don't not want to talk about him. And so whenever, I'm sure you've heard about this, but when friends come to the door or they come round, a lot of people, if you meet, people are scared to talk about it, aren't they? Whereas I'm never afraid to talk about Mel. I never know when I'm going to burst into tears, but I'm happy to talk about him, because I just think that would be awful if I just felt or people felt too scared that they couldn't bring up his name. So I tend to bring up his name all the time, and so make it easier for people. And also I don't want to not talk about him.
No, bringing his memory alive and having ways of connecting to him, although he's died, is incredibly important. And I can hear that you really recognise that although your relationship was different to Mel, the love your kids had for him is huge, and that they're grieving too. But it sounds like you have, with Melly, you made a family that pulls together when terrible things happen. And a lot of families pull apart. And so that is something that you and he have created together, which is something I hope you really recognise and are really proud of.
Yes, I think so. I think you're spot on. I think that as a family, we were always close, but it's definitely brought us even closer. It feels like we're this really tight little ball that needs each other, and we just want to spend more time together and do family things together. And so, it's a really important support network, isn't it, for each other, I think. So I can't quite imagine without all of our kids, the kids and us all together. I don't know quite how we would have survived it, actually, to be honest. If we were a dysfunctional family, I think that would be very, very hard. So it's made us even closer than we were before.
And that love and connection together. And, children learn how to manage by what you model as parents. So you've modeled having hope, making meaning, being positive, doing the things to have life in your life, allow yourself to feel the pain, express the pain, remember Mal. So it feels so psychologically painful and hard, but also natural and holistic and loving. And it gives me a lot of hope for all of you. I can see that you are managing it, if that's the right word. I'm not sure if that's the right word. Living with it, accommodating it.
Yeah, I hope so. One thing we haven't done is, I mentioned it earlier, but we haven't picked up his ashes yet. And it's just one of those things that I don't know what other people say when they're grieving or whatever, but it's just this horrific thought of Mel being in an urn. And I just, at the moment, none of us can face picking them up. But then we started having a conversation about it the other day and saying he would be joking about it, about the fact that he's in an urn somewhere, and that, for goodness sake, come and pick me up and stick me somewhere, or I don't know. I think he'd find it all quite amusing, actually, and he would make us laugh, and he would have found a funny way of looking at it. And at some point, we do need to just get over this hurdle of this awful thought that he's in an urn somewhere. I just can't actually get my head around it. I don't know what other people say. Some people wear some of the ashes around their neck in a locket or something, and I can't even imagine doing that, because it just feels like, I don't know, everyone's different, aren't they? But I can't bear the thought of him like that.
No.
I don't want to visualize him as ashes. And so I'm finding it very hard to even contemplate picking up this urn at some point. But I know it's gone on for quite a long time, and maybe it's really unfair to leave him down at the undertaker's, and we should go and sort it out. But yes, I have no idea what other people say about it, or whether other people have left it as long as I have no idea.
I mean, I can really get that, given the suddenness and the unexpectedness of his death, and then the funeral that you had to have, in some ways, collecting his ashes and what you're going to do, making decisions about what you're going to do with the ashes, is the last kind of physical act that you're going to do in relation to his physical body. And so there isn't a right or a wrong. Everyone does it in their own time. There are people who've left ashes for 18 months, 2 years before they've collected them. So my kind of, as a way to end, if this is a way to end, is that to give yourself compassion and space and time to do it when you're ready, because this is something that you can choose. And so do it in what feels like the right time, when you can, and don't put yourself under pressure. And there may be a point where you feel like, I've just got to go and do it, and that will emerge. And then together as a family, you can decide what you do with the ashes. And it could be that you have them at home for a long time before you do anything with them, or just keep them at home.
Yeah, it's interesting here, because as I said before at the start, never had any concept of any of this, and suddenly having to face all these decisions, and it's just awful.
It's awful.
But at one point, because Mel was a sailor, the best man at our wedding, he was saying, what about we scatter them in the sea? And I thought, that sounds quite nice. I think Mel would have liked that. But then he loved Richmond parks, and then we thought, maybe we go to the parks. I know you're allowed to do that if you organise it with them. And then the kids were saying, what about a bit here and a bit there and a bit somewhere else? And I was like,
but you can do that. I mean,
well, sure
you may not like the idea of it, but it doesn't have to be all of the ashes in one place.
No, but then I thought, what a weird concept that is. You're splitting it all up and in different places. And I thought, I don't know if I like the idea of that. So, all of it is to be decided, but all awful. It's grim. But I know that Mel would have laughed about it and found something highly amusing to entertain us all with ideas about it.
But I would listen to that and listen to yourself and let yourself have one thought, have another thought, change your mind, make up your mind, feel Mel with you, advising you. and then your decision will emerge. And it is painful, extremely painful, because it is the absolute ultimate reality when you pick up his ashes, that you know in a way that you can't not know that he's died.
No, I know. Yeah, I mean, there's no way around it. I just know I've got to pick up the phone and call them at some point and go down there. And then I'm already visualising the transportation of that. Whereas, and it reminds me of when Mel and I first had our first baby, Amber, and being so careful the way we drove the car at about 10 miles an hour with her in the sort of baby seat at the back of the car, and thinking this was our first baby. And it has this vision of, oh my goodness, you're going and picking up his ashes, and how on earth do you transport them? And it's just a bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
The whole thing. But I know I do need to get over that at some point.
And talk to them. Maybe the first step is finding out what you can do, because it feels like the ignorance also brings more fear. So if you ring the funeral directors or wherever he is and find out, what do people do? How do you transport the ashes? What's a way to protect them? Get information, because that will help you make your decision.
Yeah, I know. It's all just, I can't even believe we're having to it's honestly, it's like talking about somebody else having this conversation. I can't even believe it's real. Do you know what I mean? It's
surreal. It's surreal.
It really is. I was interested in what you said about dancing. You mentioned something else. You said yoga, dance, and something else.
EMDR, eye movement.
What was it called?
Eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR.
Oh, wow. Oh, I've never heard of that before. It sounds very. I might have to look that up.
But I think
I'm
we need
interested in how that's helped.
We could talk. You and I can talk more about that.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But I just want to say thank you so much for being so open and so honest. I know it will help lots of people who are going through the same thing or have been through a similar thing. And I really appreciate all of you and this incredibly tender and precious conversation. So thank you so much.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. And I'm sorry that I blubbed my way through the whole thing. So I hope it's through all my tears. But thank you for talking to me. I've enjoyed talking to you.
It's been really lovely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So, Emily and Sophie, lovely to see you. And having listened to Annabel Croft's episode, it was incredibly moving, and she was so open. I wonder what the things that sort of hit most strongly kind of struck you.
She was so generous, wasn't she, in sharing the sort of, the sort of real emotional depth of her loss. And, I could feel, listening to it, the sort of shock in my body that she felt in her. And also sort of reminded me, I guess, that, when we say, and you say often, Mum, that sort of unexpected death, out of nowhere, is often more complicated to grieve than others. That doesn't, they had been given a terminal diagnosis, but it happening in such an unexpected way, much more suddenly, does have a very similar effect to having, someone who might have died in an accident. And part of that, isn't it, is that you don't get to make sense of the death with your partner. That's one of the major losses of this kind of way of losing someone, is if you're not expecting it to happen at that point and you haven't started those conversations, it sort of means all the grieving has to be done on your own, and all the sense making of what has happened is then done on your own, rather than kind of being able to do that together before the death.
Exactly. I was thinking that, and I was also thinking, it's like an assault on the system. It's like you've started a sentence and it's like an unfinished sentence. And that happened both when she was given the news, where she expected everything to be okay, and his death. So there's a kind of double whammy on that, and no opportunities to really, I'm sure they said, I love you every day, but it just feels so surreal, doesn't it, to her and to us listening.
Yeah, and also her experience of healthcare was just so appalling. Mum, more than anyone, but the impact on the people receiving news, on the outcomes of your bereavement and grief, is like, there's a lot of research about how you're told about something, how you're supported in that moment, has quite a significant impact on the grieving process. And empathy is such a basic skill. And I know doctors are sort of often in kind of survival mode and they have to turn off for whatever reason. But, when it has such a big impact on people's lives, it does feel very important for doctors to kind of get the support that they need so that then they can deliver news in a way that is more empathic. I always think that there's so many, as therapists, we're really lucky that we have supervision really built into the profession, right? So you have somebody that you can talk about to help you process the things that are going on and help you see things differently and
learn from your mistakes.
And there's really very few other professions that have supervision in the sense that therapists have supervision, which is really just about your own experience as opposed to thinking about, the sort of practical. I remember going to visit an oncologist with our nanny when she was very ill with cancer. And in the oncology appointment, our nanny asked, "Am I going to die?" And the way that this oncologist answered was just such a beautiful example of how to sort of practice empathy. She was completely honest, but she was so gentle and kind that it really felt like, this is how you deliver something that's going to always be unbearable to hear.
Well, that just makes me a bit sad thinking of also that memory.
Yeah.
So I'm distracted by that for a moment. But I also, when you were talking about supervision, I was just thinking about today. Like today, I ran over with a client and ended up being late for another client, which is really rare for you. I'm basically pretty good with time. So as you were talking, I was thinking, when I was driving on the way here, processing that, what happened and everything, cascading and then being rushed and all this sort of thing. Oh, it's good I got supervision. It's a place I can go and be like, well, what happened there? Why did I get caught up? And whereas if, systems make such a difference, don't they, about whether the systems that you're in, whether or not they support you to be the best version of what you can be or not. And I think the NHS at the moment is really struggling with that. And it has these kind of cascades of distress, don't they, when systems are not working so well.
And I completely agree with you. And the thing that when she talked about both the times that she was broken the news, first of all, the consultant, who said he didn't know about nutrition and was incredibly kind of dismissive and unempathic, but then much worse, the psychopath, it's stuck in her system. And that would block her capacity to process trauma because she's hooked on the message, and it's like a live video that all of us have had those experiences when someone has kind of assaulted us with the way they've treated us. And it made what was already really devastating so much worse. And I completely agree with both of you about supervision. And, I used to teach Breaking Bad News at St. Mary's. And part of my teaching was that they would have what I call the debrief every time they were kind of breaking bad news or somebody died. And there was a model for it, which actually I'll link to the show notes, because they do need, the research shows that doctors feel their capacity to break bad news is received much better than the people that receive it. So they think they're better at it than the patients. But they don't get feedback. So we ask our clients, our patients, to give us feedback. We have reviews, and then we have supervision. And I have supervision. I had it like last week when there was a whole gap of my understanding that I hadn't realized I didn't have until my supervisor said, "Have you thought of doing this?" And it was a basic thing. And I went, "No, haven't."
Yeah, and it does feel like for Annabel, something was stolen from her. Like the opportunity to have that goodbye, that moment of, like a good death really was stolen from her. Obviously not just in the circumstance of it being so sudden, but also in this woman doing what she didn't want and what she felt was not right for him. And I imagine that you just kind of replay that over and over again.
No, it was like that. I mean, I think doing Strictly was such a big distraction that it sort of, there were moments or times of the day that it blocked her, but it felt to me like it woke her in the night. It haunted her. And she's missing the love of her life, who's been the love of her life since she was, a teenager. And it was so sad, that idea of them missing their future, and that they'd sit on a bench and say, we don't need much, we just need each other, and we need this. And that he said, I'll miss you every night. I thought, oh my God,
you were going to start crying.
I definitely cried listening to it. It does, just as one of the reasons, I guess, why it feels such a generous offering, and I hope helpful to people listening. It's such a powerful just reminder of that the process of grief and mourning is so hard. Like, coming into reality isn't this kind of, I think if you haven't had a major loss in your life, you can forget what a journey somebody is on. That to process the idea that you cannot speak, touch, or hear that person ever again in your lifetime is a mammoth transition and loss, and it has so many layers to it, from waking up in the morning and having her cup of tea on her own to all your future you planned and all the memories of your past and all the what ifs. And it's just helpful from a sort of empathy point of view. It also made me think about sort of moving away from Annabel's story in particular, but something about this thing in life which happens obviously a lot in the kind of circumstances Annabel was in, but also in life generally, of how to balance holding hope. And I'd be interested in what you guys think about this. Holding hope, hoping for the best, but also being able to tolerate reality so that you can plan or think about what could happen in this uncertain future. So I was thinking, I know that you and Dad, Mum, have talked about death and dying and what would happen, and you could go marry this person, like in a jokey way, but also in a serious way, both aspects. And in a way, I was thinking, I don't think I've done that with Jake really yet, with my husband. I'm listening to an audiobook at the moment by Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, called something like The Art of Zen and Saving the Planet. It's not quite it, but something like that. And in it, he's talking about the difference between being in a state of anxiety and fear, and therefore trying to anticipate and control the future, which is more a kind of fearful, worry state of mind, versus using mindfulness or supporting yourself to be really present, and from that place of presence, planning, which is a much more connected process as opposed to a kind of, how do we solve this? How do we solve this? I don't know what you think about that kind of hope.
Well, I think I sort of I think at the beginning I thought you were talking about one thing, and then at the end I thought you were talking about another thing. So at the beginning I thought you were talking about, like, when you have a diagnosis like a terminal diagnosis, how do you hold the hope and do things that are sort of outside the realm of like really typical medicine, like acupuncture or nutritionists, and really keep positive, while also having those difficult conversations to make sure that you can say the things that you would have wanted to say before somebody dies. And like you say, Soph, the planning of what you would want to happen to your body and all of those things. So I thought you were talking about that. So that's what I was thinking about.
She was.
I was. And then I went off into my little Zen Buddhist moment.
Yes. But
that was in the sense of like, yes, anyway, carry on.
Yes. So then I was thinking about how I definitely think about death much more since I've had children than I did before I had children, because it just feels like it would be so much worse if I died now, like for me, than before I had children. And yet, so I think about it loads more. I'm more anxious about it. And yet I haven't updated my will since I've had children. So I'm obviously also in like some sort of denial about the fact that I could die.
Me too.
And I think, I'd love people listening to kind of reflect on that for themselves. Like, how much do they kind of let the idea of their dying, or the important member of their family die, and then they just let it kind of fall out of their brain and don't take any action on it? Or do they completely deny it? Or do they actually take action and organize their will? Or like, I have a living will, and I sat next to somebody at dinner this week who has written his funeral. And I have actually had thoughts of my funeral often. I've often thought about my funeral, but I haven't written much down. So I think we all, I think we do this thing of daring to look at brutal things we don't want to look at and turning away. And I don't think we can immerse ourselves in both. So I do think it's with your question, Sophie, about hope and the Zen mindfulness, I think there's this thing of holding both, of that you have to have hope and aim for hope. And you have to be able to turn to, if your plan A and plan B don't work, so that you can support yourself of hope not succeeding.
I actually think I actually think the reason I haven't done the will is because it's so much more unbearable to think about the possibility of happening. So somehow the more anxious you are about anything, really, like death is obviously a really big one, the more you're like, whoa, I'm just going to close those curtains and not do the things that you actually can do, that you should do, that are relatively simple to do. Yeah, so I think sometimes actually like the two go together.
I think that's true.
Definitely. And that was sort of what I was trying to make about, maybe I wasn't very clear about my mindfulness, was that you can worry more about death, but actually do nothing about it. Whereas if you actually sit and tolerate and be with it as an awareness, then from that can come real concrete action. Like, okay, if I could sit down and really be like, okay, contemplate the dying and leaving my children behind, and then think seriously about my will, that comes from a much more connected, thoughtful place than like the multiple thoughts that I also have much more of, like, oh, I'm gonna die, or they don't die, or any of the those sort of fears.
We need to come to the end, so I just really want to value and appreciate Annabel for her openness and her honesty, and I'm sure it will be invaluable to everybody listening. And for those of you listening, if there's someone you think this would be useful or important for, do please share it and let others know about us, and rate and subscribe. And thank you for listening.